So the purpose of this presentation is to introduce the current political and social situation in Mexico and elaborate on some of the functions and effects of violence as a discursive practice. We want to emphasize that we are presenting a highly situated perspective on what's a very vast and complex situation. So we're only intending to speak from within our particular set of experiences and in our particular place as academics, artists, and activists in Mexico City. Our hope in organizing this thing is that we can have a fruitful and creative discussion with you about what actions we can take on both sides of the border to mitigate the worst of the effects of this violence. And hopefully we can propose viable resistance strategies. And just a warning, I imagine all of you know, but we're going to be looking directly at some representations of spectacles of brutality in contemporary Mexican life. And the material is upsetting. I'm Jorge Gomez del Campo, and back there by the camera and the computer is Miroslava Tovar. Miroslava is a post-pornographic video artist and activist in Mexico City. She is currently working on her master's thesis, which looks at anarchist queer resistance strategies in Latin America and their troubled history under Latin American dictatorships. Miroslava and I are both active with various queer, trans-feminist, and anarchist groups like Bloque Rosa and Casa Gomorra, which organize and build community from dissident expressions of sexuality and gender. My academic and artistic work focuses on understanding contemporary spectacles of violence as discursive and signifying practices that are closely linked to postmodern capitalism, consumerism, and eroticism. I have a couple of artist books and a portfolio here that I'll pass around and you guys can look at, as long as they eventually make their way back to Miroslava there in the corner. And maybe this monstrosity will start over here. In Mexico, we live completely saturated with all kinds of violence on a daily basis. Accurate numbers are really hard to come by. For instance, during the Calderón administration, estimates of those killed in the drug war range from a low around 55,000 to a high near 100,000. The most recent numbers I've seen about the first 2 years of the Peña Nieto administration estimate about an additional 42,000 killed. In addition to these murders linked with drug crime, there are countless others. For instance, according to an NGO that monitors femicides in Mexico, approximately 3,892 femicides were committed in 2012 and 2013 alone. That's more than 5 per day. Additionally, a staggering number of other hate crimes, tortures, rapes, armed robberies, kidnappings, and extortions take place all the time. The vast majority of these crimes never see any kind of judicial proceeding or investigation. Estimates for convictions of violent crimes in Mexico are as low as 2%. It's not uncommon where we live in Mexico City to find mutilated bodies dumped almost anywhere, from nice neighborhoods in the south to the sewage canals north of the city. These statistics are a bit impersonal, so I just want to give a couple of brief examples of that we are always missing the point of violence, that we've never quite managed to understand it. Most of the time, we tend to respond to violence as if it were something merely senseless or irrational, as if it were part of a binary opposition, savagery and civilization, or alternatively, as something merely exciting and pleasurable. Neither of these options really allow for creative thinking about violence. We can only say something like, oh dear, how horrible, how senseless, or wow, how cool. Violence is much more than that. My own personal experience as a perpetrator of relatively small acts of violence, as a victim of state violence, as well as all of my empirical, interpretive, and artistic work on violence, has led me to conclude that violence is the exact opposite of senseless savagery or pleasure. It is a deeply rational, discursive, and signifying practice. In order to study all this, I first had to figure out how to directly study acts of violence without either being killed or being complicit. In narco videos, I found a good way to approach violence without much risk or complicity. A narco video is any of the many videos cartels and/or government agencies, the difference isn't always very clear, upload to narco blogs and social networks in which the acts of torture, sexual and non-sexual humiliation, corpse mutilation, and murder are intentionally orchestrated for recording and distribution. This is to say that the video itself is part of the act of violence, not only a record of it. It's important and useful to look closely at these videos because of what they tell us about ourselves and about the narratives behind all of the cadavers we are producing in Mexico. When I started my investigation, many of my Mexican colleagues from the states most affected by narco violence were already talking about the displays of corpses as if they were some kind of installation art. Bodies hung from bridges or laid out in lawn chairs clearly have an aesthetic element. I found this to be true as well in the narco videos. There is a very clear relationship between the narco videos and some forms of contemporary art. That relationship is not exactly aesthetic. It is more structural and conceptual. And this argument is a little long and complicated and really only tangentially interesting to this talk. But I do want to say that in analyzing the form and content of these videos, I found that they were the logical conclusion of the concrete aesthetic of transgression present in art from about 1850 onward, a time period that corresponds with the development of contemporary capitalism. To say this in another, clearer way, what I found was that these videos are the apotheosis of capitalist aesthetics. It's important to note that the videos, like the culture at large, gender their violence. In fact, you can look at the videos as a homosocial or homosexual performance in which the protagonists exchange signifiers of their own power and desire through the sometimes literally emasculated and humiliated victim. The mise-en-scène of the videos of the Cartel del Golfo and of the Zetas even recreate specific compositions present in most gangbang porn, in which the phallus or the long gun looms over the victim, or the willing participant in some variations of the genre, who serves as a means for the transfer of power between agents. The way that the videos represent gender is also an extension of capitalist imagery, of the logic that casts the feminine body as the object of masculine desire to sell just about anything. The difference in the videos is that the objectified feminine body, or even a simulated, stylized cadaver, is replaced with an actual, eroticized, mutilated cadaver. This is capitalist imagery at its most honest. The videos represent masculinity in a similar fashion. In recent history, the image of the masculine body in advertising, toys, and movies has progressed from an old-fashioned, rugged individual to a hyper-masculine, muscle-bound robot or fantasy superhero. The image of masculinity in the videos is the same. We are given a tableau in which a victim is transformed into a phallus to be exchanged among men through the controlled release of primitive brutality. This almost always happens with a backdrop constructed of a phalanx of immobile men dressed in and displaying the vestments and insignia of state power, military clothes and long guns. These men who never participate in the brutality are the new image of narco-masculinity, tough, cold, unaffected. But ironically, these men are also confronting their future, a horrible death by torture and humiliation. The position they occupy in the videos mimics the structure of the capitalist alienated subject. This argument is also a little complex and steals from Bataille's eroticism, Elaine Scarry's book The Body in Pain, and the work of Luce Irigaray. In very broad terms, it comes down to a structure in which violence is the brand or product which the alienated consumer has to consume in order to maintain a fiction of his or her own agency and continuity. This conclusion is fundamental to understanding the situation in Mexico. I think we have to think of the exaggerated cruelty and sheer volume of spectacular violence in Mexico as the primary product of a market, understood as a complex, self-capitalist subject consumes. Simplifying a bit, spectacle, in the post-Marxist sense, means the commodification of all human relations. What this has come to mean in contemporary Mexico is that the only thing left to consume and perform are violence and its insignia in the form of direct violence or in the acquisition of various signifiers of violence, power, and desire. Women, cars, exotic animals, gold-encrusted guns, designer clothes, etc. Because we ourselves are this market, because contemporary Mexico is being created by neoliberal and postmodern capitalist structures, we are always already within this structure. It is maintained not only through coercion, but through our active participation. And it's important to emphasize that this is a highly decentralized and anarchic network, maintained by highly mediated, direct, and individual acts of terror and domination. All of this, of course, presents many problems for us activists. How do you march against a market? But before we look at resistance strategies, I think we should take a look at current state violence and repression. This part of the talk would normally be given by Miroslava, as state violence is her area of expertise. But in order to save time doing simultaneous translation, I'm just going to give it a go. And I'm sure if I get something wrong, she can correct me. The first thing that we need to point out is that horrible acts of government repression are nothing new. But before 2012, for the most part, the state focused its violence on poor and indigenous people in the provinces of the country. Two of the most drastic and recent events took place in 2006 in Oaxaca and in the state of Mexico to the north of Mexico City. In Oaxaca, hundreds of civic groups organized as the APO in support of 80,000 striking teachers demanding the resignation of the corrupt governor, as well as improvements in labor and educational conditions. The APO was met with brutal repression. As many as 26 people were killed, an unknown number disappeared, and approximately 30 detained and tortured. One of our friends and fellow activists was there when he was 16 years old and told us of a night he spent pinned down behind a barricade while paramilitaries opened fire on unarmed citizens. Brad Will, a U.S. indie media journalist, was among those killed in actions by the state. In Atenco, federal, state, and local police and military forces detained, tortured, and/or raped 207 members of the Frente de Pueblos en Defensa de la Tierra and other members of La Otra Campaña of the Zapatistas. One of our activist colleagues, who forms part of an anarchist, feminist, separatist community, was one of the 26 women and girls raped while in military custody. Our current president, Enrique Peña Nieto, was then governor of the state of Mexico and said that he ordered the actions that were necessary to maintain law and order. In 2012, on the day of the inauguration of Peña Nieto, many of Mexico City's anarchist and black bloc groups put out a nationwide call to action to protest his swearing-in ceremony. The call to action was set at 8 a.m. By 9 a.m., the streets were awash in tear gas and riot batons. Dozens were injured, some seriously. One of our colleagues lost his eye to a rubber bullet. Another colleague died as the result of being struck in the head with a non-lethal projectile. Approximately 130 people were detained that day. Many, if not most, were subject to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment while in custody. Many of the women and girls detained were subject to sexual harassment or assault. Miroslava witnessed firsthand the beating and detention of her partner and 2 others that day. She escaped arbitrary detention and mistreatment by hiding among a group of tourists in a hotel. This action by local, state, and federal forces has set the tone for the Peña Nieto. The success of the autodefensas is the long tradition of policías comunitarias in the states of Guerrero, Michoacán, Chiapas, Veracruz, and Oaxaca. I don't know too much about these groups, except that they are long-standing volunteer police forces that combat organized crime at the local level and that their members are chosen by popular assembly. In addition, there are many other armed resistance groups operating in Mexico. Some estimates put the number as high as 20 or more. but I'm unsure of how corrupt or successful any of these groups have been, and I've been unable to find serious academic work looking at the level of organization and effectiveness of these groups, which would probably make a good master's project if any of you are looking to study abroad. Aside from armed resistance, there are many, many other resistance strategies. There are hundreds of university assemblies, inter-university assemblies, anarchist collectives, bike collectives, artist groups, human rights groups, victims advocates, independent media collectives, circus caravans, neighborhood associations, etc. And that's just in the capital. Millions around the country are resisting in one form or another. There are even rural towns and regions that operate entirely autonomously from the Mexican narco state, like Cherán in Michoacán and several towns and regions of Chiapas. It would be impossible to cover even a tiny fraction of this. What I want to do instead is talk about one of our friends and colleagues, Denise Alamillo, an artist, journalist, human rights worker, and activist from Monterrey. I met Denise 2 years ago at a feminist conference in Mexico City. I set up an interview with her as part of my academic work at the UNAM. In that interview, she recounted her experience organizing resistance to narco-state violence in Monterrey, the capital of Nuevo León. She told me about strategies that mostly centered on reclaiming public space from violence. For instance, when bodies turned up hung from a bridge, they would organize a queer bike ride across it. Or when violence shut down all the bars and parks of the historic downtown, they moved in, rented apartments, and opened cafes and galleries as artistic and political actions. These kinds of actions are remarkable and brave in and of themselves. But what struck me about Denise's story was that she continued to do this even after falling prey to the worst of narco-state violence. Denise was one of 2 women on a bus that was stopped on the highway by what she believes were government paramilitaries. The paramilitaries separated the women. They lined up all the men and executed them. They then kidnapped the 2 women, beat, tortured, and gang raped them, and left them for dead on the side of the road. The women managed to flag down a passing bus, who let them travel to the nearest town in the luggage compartment. They weren't allowed to travel with the passengers. When Denise arrived at the town, she made her way to the local hospital. The doctors told her that there had been no rape because her vagina had lubricated. This horrifying experience has not impeded Denise's ability to resist. From my point of view, in this context, simply continuing to live is resistance enough. Mexico is filled with stories like these, of people who will not give up hope that their lives will continue, that their loved ones will be found alive, and that perpetrators of violence will be brought to justice. In conclusion, I just want to say that we need help, that we're terrified for our safety and our ability to continue to fight. But we continue to fight. There are obvious humanitarian reasons for U.S. citizens to try and intervene in the violence in Mexico. There are also very practical reasons for activists on both sides of the border to join forces. In many ways, the fight for social justice here is the same as the fight in Mexico. The militarization of the drug war has to be stopped. The murder and incarceration of generations of young Black and Latino men has to be stopped. Violence against women has to be stopped. Violence against queers has to be stopped. We have to develop sane policies regarding the trafficking of guns and drugs. We have to dismantle the neoliberal policies which value profit and consumerism over community. In this regard, I think it would be useful to think of Mexico as a laboratory for these struggles, as a test case for the possibility of resistance when capitalism goes mad. Ultimately, we are talking about doing away with a world sustained by militarism, machismo, and endless spectacles of violence. There is no other option for us. I'd like to end with a quote by Dr. Mireles, who is a leader of the autodefensas in Michoacán. He says, "What happened in Ayotzinapa happens every day in all of Mexico. Today it is clear that the Mexican people only have two options, autodefensas or mass graves."